bbc.co.uk. So Michael, and this is in our sort of pre-3 o'clock slot, Michael, which is a new film by Markus Schleinzer, who is a casting agent turned director. Very flat, deadpan story of a boring, tidy, conservative man who works in an insurance company and keeps imprisoned at home a young boy in a custom-made cellar. During the course of the film, we see the grown-up going about his ordinary life, occasionally freeing his captive for feeding and washing, and, you know, abuse, although that is kept off-screen largely. The child is treated like a pet or a slave, or worse. Actually, most shockingly, as a child, there is one sequence in which the captor and his captive stand in front of a Christmas tree and sing Christmas carols. It is a very, very disturbing film. I can't remember the last time I felt, you know, quite so oppressed by a film. And it's interesting when he as a casting director, the director worked for a number of people. He worked for Ulrich Seidel and Shirin Neshat on Men Without Women, and of course Michael Haneke on Piano Player and White Ribbon. In fact, he cast the children for the White Ribbon. And in the press notes, there's a lot of talk about making sure that the child that they cast was able to deal with the issues that the film was dealing with. And he also talks about the deadpan tone of the film. He says, I'll read this because it's worth quoting. There's scarcely a crime that's so flatly condemned as child abuse. It's one of society's greatest crimes. Even sterling citizens who feel strongly about the law would love to return to medieval justice and start to wish all manner of things for the accused. I myself am not free of it either when I hear about things like this which go beyond what I can imagine. And over long stretches I followed the yellow press, which has been left almost entirely to deal with this subject that really shocked me, and I wanted to look at it myself. The idea of the deadpan tone of the film, which doesn't take an overt, moral stance. Clearly, the film has a moral underpinning. I'm not saying for 1 minute it doesn't. Is an idea which is actually as old as cinema himself. I mean, the director has talked about the idea that if you make the perpetrator, the horrible criminal, into a monster, then somehow you allow people to distance themselves from them. You say, oh, well, that's not a person. That's a monster. Therefore, we're not in any way implicated in this, and therefore to not understand the criminals. And he goes on to say that, in fact, in his opinion, a society can only develop to the same extent that it is able to get to grips with its offenders. Now, interestingly enough, as I said, this idea is... there's nothing new about this. If you go back to Psycho, you know, Robert Bloch always talked about the idea that Psycho was so terrifying because it could be about the boy sitting next to you. I remember... in the Vanishing, in which one of the characters is called, Le Morne, which is a joke about Le Norme, and of course the director of that film, George Schleiser, said it was about le grandeur de la banalité, the banality of evil. Actually, behind all of this is a film which is not generally recognised by the fans of Michael Haneke, who made, Funny Games. Is Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. I remember seeing Funny Games in which Haneke was... Actually, Funny Games has a very clear argument, which is, if you're enjoying violent videos, why aren't you enjoying this? And it was an idea about sort of turning the way in which the commodification of violence for entertainment purposes can be used. And this is a very, very different argument here, but that flat, deadpan tone is something which is the kind of clinical tone. The idea that something is done coldly and clinically is actually far more disturbing. But I remember very clearly John McNaughton saying the key thing about Henry is he's not Freddy, he's not Jason, he's real. And also saying that realism is a device as much as any other device in cinema. Now, in terms of Michael, here's what I think. I think that it's a film that has approached its subject very seriously, and I understand that central thing. But by making people monsters, you simply distance them, and that actually probably doesn't help anybody. I found it a very... I can't say for 1 minute that whilst I was watching the film I didn't want it to be finished, because I found it so oppressive, which it should be dealing with this subject. But I think that makes it, consequently, it's difficult to know whether you recommend that, because it is such a dispiriting experience. Also, I still think that Henry is not regarded as highly as the Haneke films, and not regarded as highly as this. And Haneke himself has said that he saw Henry and he didn't like it very much. I still think that actually that lurks in the back of all this idea of normalising the monstrous in order to make it somehow something that we get involved in and understand more. Michael is very well made, very, very clinical, very disturbing. Two fine performances from the captor and his victim, really oppressive. And in that kind of Haneke way, but what it lacks is when Haneke is making something like Funny Games, he has a thesis and argument, and it is like being told off, but the thesis and argument is made very, very clearly. I certainly, coming out of Michael for the first time, and I've only seen it once, I came out of it thinking, okay, I don't know if that adds to anything. I don't know that I haven't seen that technique used before, and I don't know that I've actually learnt anything. But that's not to say that it isn't successful on its own terms and doesn't fulfil its own remit with a horribly clinical accuracy.
I might give it a miss. Don't you think?
Well, what I think is that it does what it sets out to do. The question of whether or not
it's a Friday night. I know. Let's spend a tenner and go and see.
But you see, I would say the same thing about Funny Games, except that Funny Games is a film that actively tells the audience off and has a very, very clear and very clearly defined argument with which incidentally I disagree. No. This isn't a telling off film. This is I mean, honestly, critics came out of the screening that I saw this, and the general feeling was.
Good. Well, I think I'll go and see something else. In fact.